So I'm going to touch on two separate topics. First, I'm going to fairly quickly go through a survey that we did last year with line officers and one of the senior leadership teams. Some of you may have answered this survey, where it was looking at limits of firearm use as a management tool. And I'm just going to really quickly touch on some of the findings from that. And some of them are very similar to Julia's comments, so they should sound familiar. And then I'm going to spend a little time talking about the public, because we have a lot of assumptions about the public, and the short answer is all of them are wrong. So what did we find in terms of the top two limiting factors for prescribed fire? We had a general open-ended question that we asked. Three most often mentioned factors: burn window, implementation resources. 20% said small burn windows, lack of personnel on the day, and then personnel to do the planning, to do the NEPA, and the money to hire the specialists or demands to work on another priorities, lack of shelf stock. So those were for prescribed fire, just dominant. Then we also asked a question about, and less than 20% mentioned topics that we often say are barriers, which are smoke issues, social license, internal concerns such as risk aversion, and other larger scale priorities like timber and woolly. For prescribed fire, regular prescribed fire, these were not raised by a lot of the respondents. And we actually got a really good response rate with about, I think, almost half of the line officers responded. That was all the district rangers and all the force soups and deputies. But we also asked about large scale prescribed fire. And then you had similar answers, but they started shifting a little bit. And the biggest shifts were in relation to the increasing complexity related to it, doing a larger scale burn. And some of those have come up today with its longer duration, so we don't know if we'll have the resources availability. Smoke concerns become a bigger issue because you're asking people to put up with something for a longer period of time. And then the questions about larger scale availability of personnel with the skills for managing those larger and longer duration burns. And fatigue also did come up. That was also mentioned. And then we asked consideration of other land use issues and impacts, but these are sort of more recognizing that when you're on a larger scale, you're just going to be impacting more landholders. So grazing and holdings, the fact we have checkerboard land and endangered species started coming up as more of an issue when we started talking about larger scale prescribed burns. And then we asked about, and we had a clause at the beginning saying we are calling wildland resource benefit fires, and here's why. And basically now, resource availability is still the dominant barrier. But here you start running into PL4 and 5. So people started talking about, well, you know, we start running into problems with PL4, 5 in terms of resource availability, and that's really can limit our ability to do it. Although a few people were also making the point that I heard earlier that sometimes the fact there are no resources actually makes it easier for us to do a resource benefit fire. Internal concerns became much more important at this point in time, particularly in terms of that internal support. So I think this kind of goes a little, Julia was saying in terms of leadership, the feeling that they don't have that support for wildland resource benefit, that there's a culture of suppression for a lot of people, still that their specialists have are less comfortable, that they start running into issues with specialists, risk management and aversion, and lack of incentives. And so that basically culture, internal resistance from specialists, a quiet reluctance to assume risk from line. I will say we did ask a question about how much does personal liability influence your willingness to do a burn, and it was, I think, about a third indicated it was a strong concern. The rest were actually mostly not really. And what it seemed like is that a third who said it was a concern didn't necessarily understand that if they did it within the confines of their job, their personal liability was limited. The people who had no concerns tended to state, hey, if I'm doing it within the confines of my job, I don't have, my liability isn't there, so I'm not worried about that. And I think 97% said that they saw it as part of their job was to get more fire on the ground. That's good. And then social came up to more with wildland resource benefit. That was both in terms of the public and in terms of industry. Unsurprisingly, Region 6 timber issues came up much more in Region 6. So what were the cross-cutting themes? And this kind of gets a little bit towards what Julia said. Really clear a desire for supportive, consistent leadership. The comment was, we're being told more to burn, but we're not always provided the resources to accomplish it. The support might vary depending on the season. So once we get to PL 4 or 5, suddenly they're telling us, yeah, you can't do it. This came up more with prescribed burning. And between, the infamous Hubbard letter came up a number of times. And then that sort of lack of confidence that if something went wrong, they would have their back. That came up a lot. The phrase, I don't believe that leadership will have my back if something goes wrong, came up a little too frequently for my taste. And then basically somebody said, I believe our agency needs to make prescribed burning a priority and issue direction to that effect. The agency needs to take ownership of this and provide direction and training to our employees. That's when things will change. And so it's a sense of, sort of like we're still not convinced that this is really what we're supposed to do. We're being told we're supposed to do it, but we're not actually seeing the leadership walk the walk all the time. Desire for creation of a larger scale burning organization. So it was a lot of statements saying the larger scale you want, we need to be able to have the same ability we have on a fire. So if we can't call it, we need to call it catering if we're going to do a larger scale prescribed fire. We need to be able to share resources as easily as we do on a wildfire. So less with the wildland resource benefit fire an issue, but for larger scale prescribed burns. And hazard pay came up as a common one, although I've since learned that that's been considered, and actually there are very good reasons why hazard pay is not an option. And then the importance of partnerships came up as a really critical. The larger the burn, the more important partnerships are. Region 8 came through really clearly as one reason they probably wouldn't be getting any of their burning done without a lot of partnerships. It's key for the larger scale. It facilitates communication and creates capacity and the flexibility we need to do larger scale burns because somebody will have the staff. You're more likely to have the staff available when you want in the windows there. All right, so I'm going to talk about the public, and this would be my takeaway phrase. Beware of the imagined public. There's a lot of narratives or conventional wisdoms about the public thinks this, the public does this, and basically I've been doing research on the public for 20 years. There's only one narrative that I think holds up. The rest are not supported by empirical data. Why is it? These are narratives I've heard for 20 years, and I still hear them. And there's two reasons why. One is confirmation bias. There we go, click twice. Sampling bias and confirmation bias. So sampling bias is we take a non-representative sample and equate it to the public. So if somebody, or equate it to a larger sample. So if we keep hearing from certain people, oh my God, you can't burn, I hate the smoke. We take that one person and extrapolate, that's the entire public. Whereas people who are unhappy with us are probably going to come yell at us or call us. If they're happy with what we're doing, they're probably not going to call us. They're probably not going to come to public meetings. And if they do come to the public meeting, they're probably just going to leave, right? They're not going to come up to you afterwards and say, I love what you're doing. I mean, it'd be great if they do, and I hope they are. But the odds are higher that they're going to come talk to you when they don't like what you're doing. So we're taking the people who are the exception and treating them as if they are representative of everybody. And then the other one is confirmation bias. And so this is something we all do. In fact, I would say our society is particularly prone to it at the moment, which is once we form an opinion of something, we tend to discount information that contradicts that opinion, and we tend to give more credence to information that supports that opinion. So if you think that there is no defensible space in your neighborhood, you're going to drive through and you're going to notice every single house that does not have defensible space. And you probably aren't going to see the ones that actually do have defensible space. Or if you think everybody has defensible space, you might not notice the opposite. And I've actually literally driven through a town with two firefighters, one of whom argued the town was in good shape and one who argued it wasn't. And see that house, know that house. So, we pick our facts to fit what we've already formed an opinion about. So I'm going to go through a couple different of the false narratives. I'm going to go through this one pretty quickly because it's less relevant for you folks. But one is we like to think that they don't understand the high fire risk. That's the problem. Reality is everybody who lives in fire-prone areas, 98% of them know they live in a high fire-prone area. The assumption that because they understand the risk, they're going to do something or behave a certain way, that's just not realistic. That's not how risk works. It's very subjective. And the reality is we're looking at fire risk in a world in which all we think about is fire. They're looking at fire risk in a world in which they're thinking about 5 gazillion other things in their life. It's not their job. It's not their passion. It fits into one of many, many other risks and daily life concerns that they're thinking about. So there's a lot of very good reasons why they're not going to necessarily do what you think they should do. And it also gets shaped by things like your risk tolerance or risk aversion. So your risk attitude shapes how you respond to risk. Firefighters are more risk tolerant, so they like fire. They'll run towards fire. Other people are less risk averse. In fact, we found there's some indication people who are really risk averse choose not to live in high fire risk areas. So you're already kind of self-selecting for people who are comfortable with the risk. Trade-offs with benefits. We all put up with a risk because of the benefits we get. You get in a car every day. Pretty risky, actually, relative to a fire. Your odds of being in a car accident that injures you are much higher than any chance of injury from fire, unless you're a firefighter, but to human, most of us. But we do it because the benefit of that car is worth it. Self-efficacy, do I have the time, the money? Response efficacy, is this actually really going to make a big difference? Those all come into play in why people respond to risk the way they do. This one's more relevant. Smokey Bear has taught the public to think all fire is bad. No, sorry. We like to blame the bear. The bear has done his job really well, and his job is to say, don't go start fires. I think that's a message we want him to tell people. And when I ask people, what did he teach you? They say that I should be responsible when I'm in the woods. That's a good message. I think the fact we've been suppressing fires, 98% of fires, for almost, actually now over 100 years, is probably a better message, a stronger message conveyor to people that fire is bad. Well, we wouldn't be doing that unless fire was bad. But more to the point, the data shows that people don't think that. They are not so binary. It's only fire people who I ever run into who talk about good fire, bad fire. I never run into that with the public. And there's really good evidence that people in fire-prone areas understand fire. They understand fire as part of the landscape. They understand it's part of the ecosystem. They understand it's a necessary part of the ecosystem. So that's very clear, and it's really fascinating when you read the studies how often the authors are like, they had a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of fire. Even the scientists are kind of expecting them not to get it, and they do. And then in surveys, when we ask people, is prescribed fire an acceptable management tool, it's incredibly consistent across the country. Massachusetts, Michigan, Florida, California, 80% or more say prescribed fire is an acceptable management tool. That right there says to me very clearly a more sophisticated notion of fire than simply all fire is bad. It's basically 30% strong approval, 50% qualified. Let me know when I have 5 minutes. 5 minutes. All right. There we go. I thought it was probably somewhere around there. People don't take responsibility. Basically, people see everybody as part of the problem. They recognize fire crosses land ownership, and they recognize the risk is shared and feel like all land managers are responsible for managing their land. So basically, we'll take care of our land, but you, federal people, take care of your land. If you're going to come tell me to manage my land, you better be managing your land. And then there's no consistent demographic evidence. We like to blame certain groups. It's all these new people moving into the WUI. The data shows that they're no less aware or no less proactive in mitigating the fire risk. In fact, the data suggests they're probably more proactive in mitigating fire risk. And that goes back to confirmation bias. It goes back to 2 things. One is confirmation bias. So new people know they're new. They haven't formed an opinion about the landscape. They're receptive to information when they get it. People who've lived there for 20 years, they've already decided what's the right way to manage the land and what's the wrong way. You guys haven't been fighting fires for 20 years. Why do you suddenly want to let them go now? But the other part is 60% of moves in the United States are within the county. So they're new to that neighborhood, they're not new to the fire risk. 20% are within state, and only 20% are from out of state. And in the western US, a lot of those 20% from out of state are from California, where they actually have been managing their vegetation since the 1980s, and they actually are often the most proactive people in the community. Nor are part-time residents less likely to understand the risk than full-time. If they're less proactive, and the results on that are very mixed, some studies find there's no difference. A few find that they're less proactive. but it's a question of simply of time. I'm only here on weekends. I'm only here for a month. I don't want to deal with smoke from prescribed fires. Experience, we like to think that the experience an event. Data from natural hazards for 40 years shows that it doesn't really have the most consistent response is no change in behavior. Some people it will be the aha moment. Other people actually it creates a sense of fatalism. Won't make any difference. Or, hey, we're good. There's nothing left to burn. So all it does is make it more salient. So it becomes something that goes from one of those 1,000 things I have to think about to moving up into the top 10 of the 1,000 things I have to think about. But over 3 to 6 months, it's going to bounce down that list. Nor are there any basic demographics, income, education, or that there are meaningful regional differences. So we often like to credit the Southeast as being much more progressive. At these larger levels, the dynamics are the same in terms of acceptance in all these. So it has much more to do with very specific local context in terms of the agency relationships, fire history, these sorts of things. All right, so just to end, what are the actual influential dynamics? What are the things that when you're talking to the public you want to focus on? Knowledge. The more people understand, to Julia's point, what you're doing and why you're doing it, the higher the acceptance rates. So the more people get, and particularly critical with prescribed fire and wilderness fire is the ecological benefits. Fire risk, not so important to people. Ecological benefits, much more important to people than the fire risk. Positive thing to think about, they want the landscape that they live in to be healthy. They want it to be in good shape. It's a positive thing to think about. Fire risk, and concern about negative outcomes such as smoke and escape. Those for prescribed fire are significant. They are associated with lower acceptance levels. But the more people have, the higher their understanding of the purpose and the ecological benefits, the less concern they have about smoke and about escape, and the higher their acceptance levels. Trust. Trust in the information provider is critical, but even more important for prescribed burning and actually firefighting, trust in the people who are actually implementing the practice. So the one point increase in trust in an implementer for prescribed fire leads to a 6-point increase in acceptance of prescribed fire. And it's just confidence. Do these people know what they're doing? Do they know why they're doing it? So that's again gets to the explaining what you're doing and why you're doing it so that they understand. So with wilderness fire, the more people understand the planning that goes into it, the more they're going to be okay with it. I had a focus group once where we asked people, would you be more comfortable if they didn't immediately suppress every fire? Well, no. But how would that work? And once the moderator said, well, here's what would happen. They can't just do it on a whim. They have to have the plans in place. Their conditions have to be met. Then the people are like, well, yeah, that's a no-brainer. Of course you should be doing that more, especially if it's going to have ecological benefits, then yeah, you should totally be doing that more. They had to understand the amount of planning that went into it for them to get to that point. And that gets around to that confidence. And finally, interactive communication. That's how you change behavior. It's not through Smokey Bear, great awareness program, because it's a very simple action he's asking people to do. Don't start a fire. What we're asking people to do and accept is a much more complex topic. And for that, you need to be able to ask questions, you need to be able to clarify misperceptions, and that goes both ways. Oh, you do understand the fire issue, but I'm not going to tell you about it. What is your concern? Oh, it's smoke, you have a child with asthma? Well, let me tell you what the issues are. A third of households have someone in it who has a health issue that will be affected by smoke. Otherwise, smoke's not really an issue. It's just that. It's a health issue. But for those people, really, really salient. So interactive communication allows that knowledge building. It also helps people build trust. They get to know you. Okay, they're a decent person. They have my best interests at heart. I may not agree with them, but they're okay. And you build that trust. So this is what the model looks like. We like to think it's, if they get the fire risk, they're going to accept what we're doing because they're going to want to mitigate the fire risk. Well, it matters. You do have to see the risk to think something needs to be done, but that's not going to be enough. More important is, do we understand the process and why they're doing it? Knowledge of the ecological benefits, most critical. Knowledge of fire risk, yeah, for some people that is going to be important. Cost effectiveness has been shown in a few cases to sort of be important. Concerns do matter and do shape acceptance. Noting, though, that prescribed fire, concern about smoke and escape are negatively associated with acceptance, But a lot of the other concerns that we have, that have come up, like wildlife and aesthetics, those have as often as not come up as a reason to support the practice as to not support it. So a lot of things we think are an automatic negative concern are actually a positive concern. And if it is a negative concern, it can be mitigated with understanding. Trust, are these people credible? Are they competent? And then the communication process, is it interactive? And Julia set me up beautifully because the key part of a good communication process is transparency. Transparency is a rule of thumb people use for, is this person trustworthy? Can I trust what they're telling me? So if they don't think you're being transparent, they're not going to trust you. So transparency is really critical in how we communicate about these things. And I think, well, it's frozen, so I must be done. So yeah, and if you want, there's GTRs on a lot of this that you can get on Tree Search, and there's one or two of them in the back.